Such Were the Joys by George Orwell. Soon after I arrived at Cross Gates, not immediately, but after a week or two, just when I seemed to be settling into a routine of school life, I began wetting my bed. I was now aged 8, so that this was a reversion to a habit which I must have grown out of at least 4 years earlier. Nowadays, I believe bedwetting in such circumstances is taken for granted. It is a normal reaction in children who have been removed from their homes to a strange place. In those days, however, it was looked on as a disgusting crime which the child committed on purpose, and for which the proper cure was a beating. For my part, I did not need to be told it was a crime. Night after night I prayed with a fervor never previously attained in my prayers. Please, God, do not let me wet my bed. Oh, please, God, do not let me wet my bed. But it made remarkably little difference. Some nights the thing happened, the others not. There was no volition about it, no consciousness. You did not, properly speaking, do the deed. You were merely woke up in the morning and found that the sheets were wringing wet. After the second or third offense, I was warned that I should be beaten next time, but I received the warning in a curiously roundabout way. One afternoon, as we were filing out from tea, Mrs. Simpson, the headmaster's wife, was sitting at the head of one of the tables, chatting with a lady, of whom I know nothing except that she was on an afternoon's visit to the school. She was an intimidating, masculine-looking person, wearing a riding habit, or something that I took to be a riding habit. I was just leaving the room when Mrs. Simpson called me back, as though to introduce me to the visitor. Mrs. Simpson was nicknamed Bingo, and I shall call her by that name, for I seldom think of her by any other. Officially, however, she was addressed as Mum, probably a corruption of the ma'am used by public school boys to their house-masters' wives. She was a stocky, square-built woman with hard red cheeks, a flat top to her head, prominent brows, and deep-set, suspicious eyes. Although a great deal of the time she was full of false heartiness, jollying one along with mannish slang, "Buck up, old chap," and so forth, and even using one's Christian name, her eyes never lost their anxious, accusing look. It was very difficult to look her in the face without feeling guilty, even at moments when one was not guilty of anything in particular. "Here is a little boy," said Bingo, indicating me to the strange lady, "who wets his bed every night. Do you know what I am going to do if you wet your bed again?" she added, turning to me. "I am going to get the sixth form to beat you." The strange lady put on an air of being inexpressibly shocked, and exclaimed, "I should think so!" And here occurred one of those wild, almost lunatic misunderstandings which are a part of the daily experience of childhood. The sixth form was a group of older boys who were selected as having character, and were empowered to beat smaller boys. I had not yet learned of their existence, and I misheard the phrase "the sixth form" as "Mrs. Form." I took it as referring to the strange lady. I thought, that is, that her name was Mrs. Form. It was an improbable name, but a child has no judgment in such matters. I imagined, therefore, that it was she who was to be deputed to beat me. It did not strike me as strange that this job should be turned over to a casual visitor in no way connected with the school. I merely assumed that Mrs. Form was a stern disciplinarian who enjoyed beating people. Somehow her appearance seemed to bear this out, and I had an immediate terrifying vision of her arriving for the occasion in full riding kit and armed with a hunting whip. To this day I can feel myself almost swooning with shame as I stood, a very small, round-faced boy in short corduroy knickers, before the two women. I could not speak. I felt that I should die if Mrs. Form were to beat me. But my dominant feeling was not fear or even resentment. It was simply shame because one more person, and that a woman, had been told of my disgusting offense. A little later, I forget how, I learned that it was not after all Mrs. Form who would do the beating. I cannot remember whether it was that very night that I wetted my bed again, but at any rate I did wet it again quite soon. Oh, the despair! The feeling of cruel injustice after all my prayers and resolutions, at once again waking between the clammy sheets! There was no chance of hiding what I had done. The grim statuesque matron, Daphne by name, arrived in the dormitory especially to inspect my bed. She pulled back the clothes, then drew herself up, and the dreaded words seemed to come rolling out of her like a peal of thunder. "Report yourself to the headmaster after breakfast." I do not know how many times I heard that phrase during my early years at Crossgates. It was only very rarely that it did not mean a beating. The words always had a portentous sound in my ears, like muffled drums or the words of the death sentence. When I arrived to report myself, Bingo was doing something or other at the long shiny table in the anteroom to the study. Her uneasy eyes searched me as I went past. In the study, Mr. Simpson, nicknamed Sim, was waiting. Sim was a round-shouldered, curiously oafish-looking man, not large, but shambling in gait, with a chubby face which was like that of an overgrown baby, and which was capable of good humor. He knew, of course, why I had been sent to him, and had already taken a bone-handled writing crop out of the cupboard, but it was a part of the punishment of reporting yourself that you had to proclaim your offense with your own lips. When I had said my say, he read me a short but pompous lecture, then seized me by the scruff of the neck, twisted me over, and began beating me with the riding crop. He had a habit of continuing his lecture while he flogged you, and I remember the words, "You dirty little boy," keeping time with the blows. The beating did not hurt, perhaps as it was the first time he was not hitting me very hard, and I walked out feeling much better. The fact that the beating had not hurt was a sort of victory, and partially wiped out the shame of the bedwetting. I was even incautious enough to wear a grin on my face. Some small boys were hanging about in the passage outside the door of the anteroom. "Did you get the cane?" "It didn't hurt," I said proudly. Bingo had heard everything. Instantly her voice came screaming after me. "Come here! Come here this instant! What was that you said?" "I said it didn't hurt," I faltered out. "How dare you say a thing like that? Do you think that is a proper thing to say? Go in and report yourself again." This time Sim laid on in real earnest. He continued for a length of time that frightened and astonished me. About 5 minutes it seemed, ending up by breaking the writing crop. The bone handle went flying across the room. "Look what you've made me do," he said furiously, holding up the broken crop. I had fallen into a chair, weakly sniveling. I remembered that this was the only time throughout my boyhood when a beating actually reduced me to tears. And curiously enough, I was not even now crying because of the pain. The second beating had not hurt very much either. Fright and shame seemed to have anesthetized me. I was crying partly because I felt that this was expected of me, partly from genuine repentance, but partly also because of deeper grief which is peculiar to childhood and not easy to convey. A sense of desolate loneliness and helplessness of being locked up not only in a hostile world, but in a world of good and evil, where the rules were such that it was actually not possible for me to keep them. I knew that bedwetting was A, wicked, and B, outside my control. The second fact I was personally aware of, and the first I did not question. It was possible, therefore, to commit a sin without knowing that you committed it, without wanting to commit it, and without being able to avoid it. Sin was not necessarily something that you did, it might be something that happened to you. I do not want to claim that this idea flashed into my mind as a complete novelty at this very moment, under the blow of Sim's cane. I must have had glimpses of it, even before I left home, for my early childhood had not been altogether happy. But at any rate this was the great, abiding lesson of my boyhood, that I was in a world where it was not possible for me to be good. And the double beating was a turning point, for it brought home to me for the first time the harshness of the environment into which I had been flung. Life was more terrible, and I was more wicked than I had imagined. At any rate, as I sat on the edge of a chair in Sim's study, with not even the self-possession to stand up while he stormed at me, I had a conviction of sin and folly and weakness, such as I do not remember to have felt before. In general, one's memories of any period must necessarily weaken as one moves away from it. One is constantly learning new facts, and old ones have to drop out to make way for them. At 20, I could have written the history of my school days with an accuracy which would be quite impossible now. But it can also happen that one's memories grow sharper after a long lapse of time, because one is looking at the past with fresh eyes and can isolate, and is, as it were, notice facts which previously existed, undifferentiated among a mass of others. Here are two things which in a sense I remembered, but which did not strike me as strange or interesting until quite recently. One is that the second beating seemed to me a just and reasonable punishment. To get one beating, and then to get another, and far fiercer one on top of it, for being so unwise as to show that the first one had not hurt, that was quite natural. The gods are jealous, and when you have good fortune, you should conceal it. The other is that I accepted the broken riding crop as my own crime. I can still recall my feeling as I saw the handle lying on the carpet, feeling of having done an ill-bred, clumsy thing, and ruined an expensive object. I had broken it, so Sim told me, and so I believed. This acceptance of guilt lay unnoticed in my memory for 20 or 30 years. So much for the episode of the bedwetting. But there is one more thing to be remarked. That is that I did not wet my bed again. At least, I did wet it once again and received another beating, after which the trouble stopped. So perhaps this barbarous remedy does work, though at a heavy price, I have no doubt. All this was 30 years ago and more. The question is, does a child at school go through the same kind of experiences nowadays? The only honest answer, I believe, is that we do not with certainty know. Of course, it is obvious that the present day attitude towards education is enormously more humane and sensible than that of the past. The snobbishness that was an integral part of my own education would be almost unthinkable today, because the society that nourished it is dead. I recall a conversation that must have taken place about a year before I left Crossgates. A Russian boy, large and fair-haired, a year older than myself, was questioning me. "How much a year has your father got?" I told him what I thought it was, adding a few hundreds to make it sound better. The Russian boy, neat in his habits, produced a pencil and a small notebook and made a calculation. "My father has over 200 times as much money as yours," he announced with a sort of amused contempt. That was in 1915. What happened to that money a couple of years later, I wonder? And still more, I wonder, do conversations of that kind happen at preparatory schools now? The question is not whether boys are still buckled into Eton collars on Sunday or told that babies are dug up under gooseberry bushes. That kind of thing is at an end, admittedly. The real question is whether it is still normal for a school child to live for years amid irrational terrors and lunatic misunderstandings. And here one is up against the very great difficulty of knowing what a child really feels and thinks. A child which appears reasonably happy may actually be suffering horrors which it cannot or will not reveal. It lives in a sort of alien underwater world which we can only penetrate by memory or divination. Our chief clue is the fact that we were once children ourselves, and many people appear to forget the atmosphere of their own childhood almost entirely. Think, for instance, of the unnecessary torments that people will inflict by sending a child back to school with clothes of the wrong pattern, and refusing to see that this matters. Over things of this kind, a child will sometimes utter a protest, but a great deal of the time its attitude is one of simple concealment. Not to expose your true feelings to an adult seems to be instinctive from the age of 7 or 8 onwards. Even the affection that one feels for a child, the desire to protect and cherish it, is a cause of misunderstanding. One can love a child, perhaps more deeply than can one love another adult, but it is rash to assume that the child feels any love in return. Looking back on my own childhood after the infant years were over, I do not believe that I ever felt love for any mature person except my mother, and even her I did not trust, in the sense that shyness made me conceal most of my real feelings from her. Love. The spontaneous unqualified emotion of love was something I could only feel for people who were young. Towards people who were old, and remember that old to a child means over 30 or even 25, I could feel reverence, respect, admiration, or compunction, but I seemed cut off from them by a veil of fear and shyness mixed up with a physical distaste. People are too ready to forget the child's physical shrinking from the adult. The enormous size of grown-ups, their ungainly, rigid bodies, their coarse, wrinkled skins, their great, relaxed eyelids, their yellow teeth, and the whiffs of musty clothes and beer and sweat and tobacco that disengage from them at every moment. Part of the reason for the ugliness of adults in a child's eyes is that the child is usually looking upwards, and few faces are at their best when seen from below. Besides, being fresh and unmarked itself, the child has impossibly high standards in the matter of skin and teeth and complexion. But the greatest barrier of all is the child's misconception about age. A child can hardly envisage life beyond 30, and in judging people's ages it will make fantastic mistakes. It will think that a person of 25 is 40, that a person of 40 is 65, and so on. Thus, when I fell in love with Elsie, I took her to be grown up. I met her again when I was 13, and she, I think, must have been 23. She now seemed to me a middle-aged woman, somewhat past her best. And the child thinks of growing old as an almost obscene calamity which for some mysterious reason will never happen to itself. All who have passed the age of 30 are joyless, grotesques, endlessly fussing about things of no importance and staying alive without, so far as the child can see, having anything to live for. Only child life is real life. The schoolmaster who imagines he is loved and trusted by his boys is in fact mimicked and laughed at behind his back. An adult who does not seem dangerous nearly always seems ridiculous. I base these generalizations on what I can recall of my own childhood outlook. Treacherous though memory is, it seems to me that the chief means we have of discovering how a child's mind works. Only by resurrecting our own memories can we realize how incredibly distorted is the child's vision of the world. Consider this, for example. How would Crossgates appear to me now if I could go back at my present age and see it as it was in 1915? What should I think of Bingo and Sim, those terrible, all-powerful monsters? I should see them as a couple of silly, shallow, ineffectual people, eagerly clambering up a social ladder which any thinking person could see to be on the point of collapse. I would be no more frightened of them than I would be frightened of a dormouse. Moreover, in those days they seemed to me fantastically old, whereas though of this I am not certain, I imagine they must have been somewhat younger than I am now. And how would Johnny Hall appear, with his blacksmith's arms and his red jeering face? Merely a scruffy little boy, barely distinguishable from hundreds of other scruffy little boys. The two sets of facts can lie side by side in my mind because these happen to be my own memories. But it would be very difficult for me to see with the eyes of any other child, except by an effort of the imagination which might lead me completely astray. The child and the adult live in different worlds. If that is so, we cannot be certain that school, at any rate boarding school, is not still for many children as dreadful an experience as it used to be. Take away God, Latin, the cane, class distinctions, and sexual taboos, and the fear, the hatred, the snobbery, and the misunderstanding might still all be there. It will have been seen that my own main trouble was an utter lack of any sense of proportion or probability. This led me to accept outrages and believe absurdities, and to suffer torments over things which were, in fact, of no importance. It is not enough to say that I was silly and ought to have known better. Look back into your own childhood and think of the nonsense you used to believe, and the trivialities which could make you suffer. Of course, my own case had its individual variations, but essentially it was that of countless other boys. The weakness of the child is that it starts with a blank sheet. It neither understands nor questions the society in which it lives, and because of its credulity, other people can work upon it, infecting it with the sense of inferiority and the dread of offending against mysterious, terrible laws. It may be that everything that happened to me at Crossgates could happen in the most enlightened school, though perhaps in subtler forms. Of one thing, however, I do feel fairly sure, and that is that boarding schools are worse than day schools. A child has a better chance with the sanctuary of its home near at hand. And I think the characteristic faults of the English upper and middle classes may be partly due to the practice, general until recently, of sending children away from home as young as 9, 8, or even 7. I have never been back to Crossgates. In a way, it is only within the last decade that I have really thought over my school days. Vividly, though, their memory has haunted me. Nowadays, I believe, it would make very little impression on me to see the place again, if it still exists. And if I went inside and smelled again the inky, dusty smell of the big schoolroom, the rosiny smell of the chapel, the stagnant smell of the swimming bath, and the cold reek of the lavatories, I think I should only feel what one invariably feels in revisiting any scene of childhood: how small everything has grown, and how terrible is the deterioration in myself.